Lots of bands over the years have enhanced my life in some form or another with their sound waves. And if you're as obsessed with music as I am, it gets a little hard to narrow down some of your favorite bands. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that ever since I was a kid, I've probably heard a few thousand albums. So, everybody likes lists. Lists of favorite bands, lists of favorite albums. It was hard for me to pick 10 favorite bands. It was also hard for me to pick 15. It was hard for me to pick 20, so... yeah, it's like picking my favorite kids. So, without being restrictive and without being stock, here are 17 of my favorite bands, currently. This list is subject to change, but over the years it's stayed relatively consistent. So, starting with number 17, Lords of Acid. Just a fun and sexy band. They don't take themselves too seriously, and they sing about some pretty dumb stuff while you can also dance to it. I mean, on their first album, there's a song about having sex with aliens. Need I say more? What I like about Lords of Acid is that every album has a different singer. And Pragakon is pretty good at songwriting abilities while also programming really cool synth stuff and really cool drum patterns. It doesn't matter if your pants are on or off, Lords of Acid is a fun band either way. Number 16, Dystopia. Now here's a band with a definitive sound. Crust, punk, sludge, grindcore, doom metal, Dystopia has it all! I was 14 years old when I first heard Human Equals Garbage, and it spoke to me. It challenged my worldview, with songs about racial equality, the environment, animal rights, human emotions, things like that. What also impressed me about Dystopia was the dueling vocals and the fact that the drummer, Dino, he sang while he played drums. That's a pretty big job. Their use of movie samples to drive the message of the songs was pretty unique, blending the samples with the music. And there's a reason why they still have a following all these years after they've broken up. Number 15, the Butthole Surfers. Now, this is a band that you listen to and you think, what the hell was that? They took punk rock and turned it sideways, with tape and sound manipulations, piss takes on classic rock songs, and creating an environment that was batshit crazy all the time. I prefer their early work from the early 1980s up to PO'd with its atrocious mix job. I feel like once they got MTV hits, they were still good, but they ran out of room to experiment. Locust Abortion Technician is in a class of its own. That pure, uncut wall of sound. Okay, and number 14, Samhain. When people talk about Glenn Danzig's bands, they usually talk about the Misfits or Danzig, his solo band. So, if the Misfits sounded like the Ramones and Danzig sounds like AC/DC, what does Samhain sound like? I can't think of any band Samhain sounds like. They're in this weird space where it's a little more technical than the Misfits, but it's also more loose and not as safe as Danzig. So it's not quite punk rock, but it's also not quite goth rock either. It's really unique music, and it's a shame that they never made more albums because it's so good and so unique, and no other bands sound like them. Number 13, Caius. Best driving music ever. I never get bored of listening to Blues for the Red Sun. It's perfect for any road trip. There's, and of course there's Welcome to Sky Valley, where there's like 4 tracks and 3 of them are ridiculously long because they wanted to make sure that you listen to it all the way through. And so, it's just really fun music. And of course, the generator parties that they threw in the desert, that helped their songwriting and it kept everything spontaneous and alive and relaxed and heavy at all times. Some people prefer Queens of the Stone Age, and as much as I love Songs for the Deaf to death, Caius just, I don't know, they have my vote, just by a little much, It's just really fun music. So, number 12, AC/DC. This was the band that made me pick up guitar. The arrogance and the power behind the music is just, it's always hard all the time, and it's just so good. These songs have been in my veins since I was a kid, and they don't take themselves too seriously. It's just fun music. They got songs like Big Balls, which made me laugh my ass off, and then they have stupid stuff in the choruses of their serious songs. They tell me what to think, but they're stinking, I really don't care. What? Grown adults wrote that shit. And really, they sing about 3 things. Okay, they sing about women, they sing about drinking, and they sing about rock and roll. Like, those three things, and they sing about them all so well in a way that has so much power behind it. And the songs are well written. The guitar playing, of course, is excellent. You know, Angus Young, his solos are skillful and soulful. A good balance between the two, and of course, there's the balancing trade-off between Angus and Malcolm Young. I personally prefer the Bon Scott era over the Brian Johnson era, though I love the Brian Johnson era, no problem. There was nobody that sounded like Bon. There's also nobody that sounds like Brian either, so Powerage, Highway to Hell, Back in Black, you can't go wrong with any of it. Number 11, Black Sabbath. Do I need to explain this one? Really? Listen, they've influenced so many bands and so many people, including me, and I like all the eras. Ozzy, Dio, Ian Gillan, Tony Martin, all eras have excellent albums to offer. And unfortunately, people typically only think of the Ozzy era, but do yourself a favor. Go beyond the Ozzy albums, because this band has always progressed with time. And through the different lineups, they've come up with different ways to write heavy songs. 20 years into their career just about, they were writing songs like I and After All the Dead and Time Machine, ridiculously heavy stuff on the Dehumanizer album. And then, of course, they did more doom metal stuff, like Cross Purposes album. Really excellent stuff, and, you know, there's plenty this band has to offer. So, definitely go listen to different eras of this band, and that includes the Tony Iommi solo album with the Black Sabbath name tacked onto it, 7th Star. Yes, even that is good. And number 10, Ghoul! Sometimes all you need is a good B-movie metal band to put you in a great mood. And that's Ghoul in a nutshell. You listen to them and you think of the last Trauma movie you saw. Live, they do the costumes, they spray blood at the audience, and nobody's bored seeing them. Now, obviously there are similarities with Gwar, but they're different in the styles of music. You know, Gwar is a little more definitive, I guess. Ghoul's a little more thrash. Sometimes they have surf stuff, but they write heavy songs that are fun, and you'll always remember them. Number 9, Exorder! My favorite Exorder is Slaughter in the Vatican, the demo, and Slaughter in the Vatican, the album. I like them both for different reasons. You know, the demo has more of a lively feel to it, and the album is heavier. But, you know, these songs were written with so many twists and turns, peaks and valleys, that it just punches the life out of you every time you listen to them. And sometimes the songs would be about mean-spirited stuff like anal lust, homicide, and then of course they get into the poetic stuff like the Tragic Period, Legions of Death, and they're credited with creating the groove metal genre because they're thrash metal from New Orleans, basically. The blues and jazz influences in their veins. You know, they don't have to be in attack mode all the time, they're always heavy. Number 8, Typo Negative. Typo Negative is what you get when you get Black Sabbath to have a baby with the Beatles, and you pump that baby full of metal steroids. These guys were like your typical comedians. You know, they were miserable bastards off stage, but they had the time of their life when they were on stage. Peter Steele's voice can make bones tremble, and, you know, the songs are pretty addictive and dynamic. He would take a song about, say, a death in the family, and when you read into it, it's actually a song about Peter's cat dying. His justification for it was, oh, well, nobody wants to listen to a song about a 6'6" man crying over the death of his fucking cat, so I had to make it universal. I mean, it's a good prank of a song. These guys knew when to be heavy, but they also knew to have a lot of fun. So, you know that's typo immediately by the guitar tones, the bass tones, and the way the keyboards work with the songs. They were just good. They were really good at writing catchy songs that spoke to everybody. Number 7, Autopsy! Where a lot of bands thrive on being technical, precise, polished, Autopsy cares about none of those things. The rawer, the better. Just listen to the production on Acts of the Unspeakable. It is the most ratty sounding drum sound ever. It's vile and uncomfortable, and the lyrics are just so mean-spirited and fucked up. They were gory in ways that influenced Cannibal Corpse and Entombed. Yeah, they were that gory. So they could do fast songs, but they could also do slow songs in this weird psychedelic type of way. Like, they weren't just death metal, they also had hints of doom metal as well. Take Mental Funeral. It was an album that was recorded in a short amount of time, probably 8 days, I think. And the reason it sounds the way it does is because it sounded so raw when they finished it that Chris Reifert told the engineer to not EQ it. He said, "No, leave it alone, leave it alone." Not to mention, everybody who recorded the album was either stoned or high out of their mind while they did it, so they had a lot of fun recording it. Then, of course, there's Abscess, which, for the most part, is the same lineup as Autopsy, but it's a more punk version of Autopsy, I suppose. Sometimes I think of them as the same band, but really, you can't go wrong with Autopsy. They've never released a bad album. Number 6, Skinny Puppy. Sometimes Skinny Puppy is called the Canadian Ministry. It's not always the easiest music to listen to, and I guess that's the point. But no matter how atonal or harsh Skinny Puppy can get, there's somewhat of a beauty in everything they do. You know, it's always hard-hitting. The early stuff has movie samples, soundscapes, synths, experimental sound effects, and sometimes they'd have political or social commentary, like, say, on veganism or war. It can be fun to listen to sometimes. Just listen to Warlock off the Rabies album. It's a little hard to describe the sound of Skinny Puppy, and their projects were usually conceptual, sometimes on the spot. There's a fun terror about listening to an album like Last Rites, but there's also beauty in listening to, I don't know, dancey stuff like Remission. So, yeah, definitely a band I enjoy. No matter how harsh they could get, they were still really good at writing good songs that stayed with you. Number 5, The Ramones! The beauty in the Ramones is that once you learn the words to the songs, you don't forget them. Even though you probably should, because the lyrics are so demented. I mean, they were singing about all these fucked up songs about Nazis, sniffing glue, getting committed, having affairs with their mother-in-laws, decapitating people. And they were always so happy and cheery about it. You don't know what I can do with this axe. They'll chop off your head, so you better relax. You should never have opened that door. Now you're never gonna see her no more. I mean, you're fine and happy singing along with it until you stop and realize what they're saying, and it's like, that's terrible. Such fun and simple songs, but, you know, they knew their strengths, they knew their limits, other than that one album they did with Phil Spector. Their strength was that they played albums as fast and loud as they could. And they weren't too worried about trying to hide their accent, so... you know, sometimes they'd write bubblegum pop songs in the punk style, and most of the time it worked for them, because they were the Ramones. There was humor in the Ramones. It's just a shame that they didn't get the recognition they deserved until after they'd broken up and all the members started dying off. The music, however, lives on. Number 4, Bolt Thrower. Bolt Thrower's worst album is still a lot better than most bands' best albums. Bolt Thrower, aside from their first album, which is pretty much crust punk and grindcore, they basically had one style of music that they stuck with. Death metal with few blast beats, and they sang songs about war. Death metal that made you feel big and powerful and awesome while you listened to it. There's a lot of swing in the drums, there's a lot of groove in the guitar riffs. The songs are just that heavy and that good. And they could have been a lot bigger than they were. They did everything DIY, so, you know, sometimes they didn't like being in the spotlight, so they fought a lot of the success that tried to come their way. And it's a shame because they could have been so much bigger than they were. And, well, I guess that's the price you pay for following some of your ethics. You know, limiting beliefs, I like to call it. Not the fastest or goriest band in the world, and they never needed to be. They're just so damn heavy. Listening to Bolt Thrower is like having a big army tank crash into your living room and you're happy about it. I love this band. I love this band so much. There's not one bad album in their whole catalog. Number 3, Minister. There's so many different sounds and styles that this band has done over the years, and whatever didn't fit the concept of Ministry usually went into the millions of side projects they had. You know, like Revolting Cocks, Palehead, Lead in the Gold, Acid Horse, 1000 Homo DJs. If you want good new wave, the early Wax Trax singles are really good. And then you get into the hard industrial stuff like The Land of Rape and Honey, The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, Psalm 69. There's a lot to unpack with these albums. So much drugs were consumed during the making of these albums, and that contributed to the high volumes and testosterone for songs like Deity and Thieves. But they were also willing to push the envelope with songs like Golden Dawn, a soundscape. On Filth Pig, they ditched the electronics and went for a more sludge and doom metal sound. It's like they heard the Melvins and they said, hey, we can do that heavier and nastier. So they injected more heroin, put nastier distortion on, and they dumped every emotion they had into that album, and it's a top 10 album for me. It never gets old. You know, and part of the reason that their production was so ahead of its time was because of their interest in technology. I mean, they would chain so many compressors together, and they would set some of the equipment on fire doing so. And what else is great about old Ministry especially is the balance. You know, Al Jorgensen, he would push for these insane hard-hitting sounds and these intense extreme sounds, and then Paul Barker, he would want to step back and do a little more experimental and psychedelic stuff. And there was an interesting balance between those two sounds, and depending on who they hired to help with each album would depend on, well, what they would sound like. After Paul Barker left, the album started going downhill pretty quickly, but I'm willing to forgive the bad albums just because the albums up to the mid-2000s were so good. In fact, I'm happy with pretending that the bad albums don't even exist. Just listen to Felipe. Number 2, 9 Inch Nails. Sometimes you'll hear industrial and electronic purists give Trent Reznor crap because he took a mostly underground genre and brought it to the masses. And they'll even say, oh, 9 Inch Nails is narcissistic because he sings about himself a lot and he sings about introspection so much. Heaven forbid a guy makes music that's relatable. I mean, I love Front 242 just like anybody else who likes electronic music, but there's so much that I can take with songs about bounty hunters and technology until I'm just done with it. In any case, 9 Inch Nails, the lyrics hit a nerve with a lot of people, and in myself, they expose some emotions that I didn't know existed. The albums are always experimental, and the way he's able to take a mix with random sounds and just make it all sound big, it's perfect. I hear something new every time I listen to 9 Inch Nails. You know, the songs always have different textures, timbres, and instrumentation. Some people talk about what's the perfect album runtime. Well, I can tell you that Fragile, it's a 2-disc album, over 100 minutes long. I've listened to that album in one sitting so many times, and I never get bored with it. It's not too long for me. I feel like there's a 9 Inch Nails song for every occasion. The music takes you places. Sometimes there are places that you want to go, sometimes they're not places you want to go, but even if they're places you don't want to go, the music, it makes you feel more comfortable with those places. And my favorite band of all time is Gwar. Gwar is one of those concepts that requires a lot of things to go right in order for it to work. They've done everything DIY. Movies, comics, hot sauces, board games, barbecue, even things that probably shouldn't work within their concept, they throw it at the wall and see what sticks. It's one of the best live bands you'll ever see. Just be sure to wear a shirt that you don't care about getting ruined. The costumes, effects, monsters, storylines, the things sprayed at the audience, it's always a fun time, and you'll never get bored seeing Gwar. Of course, there are going to be some people who say that they're just a good live band and the music's not that good, but how do you put on a good live show without good music? What, do you think that Gwar could go out on stage and put a Wesley Willis tape on and do their act? People would think it sucked. You know, I'd say Gwar is pretty underrated musically. I'd put Gwar in the same league as the big bands, Slayer, Megadeth. As far as technicality, the riffing, the instrumentation, it's all so good and so well done, and there's so many good songs throughout their career. And what else I love about Gwar is they're funny, they're ballsy, and they don't really sound like other bands. You know, they have influences from all over the place, and they throw them all into the pot and see what sticks. An inspirational band, to say the least. There are plenty of bands that I could have talked about, but the list is subject to change. And I also tend to listen to music in cycles. So this month I'm obsessed with Rush and the Talking Heads, and next month I might be obsessed with Queensryche. Who knows? And just because I don't consider a band like Cancer to be a top 10 favorite band, it doesn't mean that I still won't listen to the hell out of them. And then there are other bands that I used to listen to when I was younger that I don't really listen to now, or listen to as much, like Godflesh. You know, it had been years since I'd listened to Street Cleaner, and then I listened to it again recently, and then I still knew every word to every song. It was like muscle memory. So, with all this being said, I would like to give an honorable mention to the following bands: Judas Priest, KMFDM, Motorhead, Kiss, Pink Floyd, Frontline Assembly, Agalloch, Van Halen, Hemorrhage, Abscess, Population Reduction, David Bowie, The Misfits, Carcass, Bathory, and Drab Majesty. There are plenty of other bands I've fallen in love with over the years, but it's too long of a list to name. So, thank you for listening to me talk about some of my favorite bands, and grind on.